A few months ago, a post on the Fairfax County Police Department Facebook page was simply titled, "Purchased on Friday, Totaled on Saturday." It was about a Virginia man who had just totaled a $300,000 exotic sports car that he had just purchased the day before. And while the auto is described on the manufacturer's website as ferociously fast with the ultimate balance of power and control, the photo online showed the expensive sports car wrapped around a tree, which made it very clear that the new owner did not understand how to create this balance, as he drove too fast, lost control, and ultimately crashed. I often see this exact same situation when it comes to investors. They don't really understand how to control the power of their investing or income plan and end up getting off balance and losing their way. However, the big difference I have seen between the Virginia driver and the majority of investors is that the driver did not blame the car. In this episode of Financial Insanity, I will introduce the steps needed to finally take control of your investing future and show you how to reduce the potential of moving too fast, losing control, and going off-road when we return in 30 seconds.
Welcome to Financial Insanity, the podcast that explores potential pitfalls facing old world financial concepts and introduces updated options designed to help investors thrive in the new economy. Join host Jason Vino with each episode as he discusses new ways for new days to enhance your finance and finally stop the insanity.
Play it right. You got to know when to hold up, know when to fold up, know when to walk away, and know when to run. You never count.
Not only is The Gambler one of country music's most popular songs of all time, but it also has a very interesting story behind it. The song was actually written in 1976 by a 23-year-old computer operator at Vanderbilt University named Don Schlitz. Don was an inspiring songwriter and would compose songs during his walks home after work each day. After completion of The Gambler, he spent 2 years shopping the song around Nashville before country singer Bobby Bare finally recorded it on his album. But unfortunately, Mr. Bare's version of the song never really caught on, and so it was never released as a single. Eventually, though, other musicians began to take notice of the song, including Mr. Johnny Cash, who recorded his own version in late 1978.
Just like every hand's a loser, and the best that you can hope for is to die in your sleep. You gotta know when to hold them, know when to fold them.
However, it was not until Kenny Rogers finally broke the song loose with his own version that eventually would become a #1 country hit, winning Mr. Rogers a Grammy Award and even spawned a TV movie in 1980 that became the highest-rated TV film of the year and would lead to a 5-part movie series that spanned over a 14-year period. The song was also a breakthrough for the writer Mr. Don Schlitz, who was able to quit his day job after he won both a Grammy and CMA award and was even inducted into the Songwriters Hall of Fame. Now, the interesting part of this story is that Mr. Schlitz didn't even play poker, and once said in an interview that the song wasn't actually about a card game at all, but rather was about being able to handle whatever life throws at you. This is the subject of today's episode on Financial Insanity, as we teach you as an investor specific ways that you can handle whatever life or the market or the economy may throw at you. You know, there's been a few times over the years that I've heard frustrated investors exclaim that they think that investing and gambling are the same thing. There's no difference. I've heard some say it in a joking manner and others not so much. Now, let me say this. Prudent and proper investing in support of your long-term goals is definitely not the same thing as gambling. However, I will admit that there are quite a few similarities between the two. For instance, they both involve a certain amount of unpredictability and unknowns. They both offer potential for financial profit or loss. And they both require that important decisions need to be made during times when your emotions and anxiety levels are on the rise. A few months ago, I was watching TV when a segment came on, and it was covering the World Series of Poker that's held every single year in Las Vegas since 1970. It stated this tournament is to poker as the national championship is to basketball, and how every year thousands of people line up to pay a $10,000 entry fee in hopes of winning the big prize. They then began running down the list of previous winners and highlighted the three most popular, which included a guy named Johnny Chan and Phil Ivey, who have each won the tournament a total of 10 times apiece. They then introduced Phil Hellmuth, who at the time I was watching this program was getting ready to go for his 15th win, which on a side note, he ended up winning. So here were three guys, all who entered the same competition with thousands of other people under the same conditions using the same cards, and yet they were all able to climb into the winning circle time and time again. It was at this point I couldn't help but think there had to be something in common between these guys, something they either did or didn't do that had a direct impact on their success, something that maybe could even apply to the investing world. And come to find out, not only was there a few common threads between all three, but they were also probably the most important factors that you as an investor can use to help increase your future potential for success. So to help understand this, let's explore what others have found to be some of the key elements possessed by these top poker players from around the world. And then we will break down how you as an investor can apply this to enhance your own situation. Jarrod Tendler is a licensed mental health counselor. He's the author of the popular book titled The Mental Side of Poker, and he's also a personal coach to almost 500 of the best poker players throughout the world. In his book, he explains the tipping point that separates the great poker players from the rest of the pack. And it's not based on getting better cards or having a better strategy, but rather understanding the mental aspect of your game and focusing on what you can control rather than worrying about what you can't. He found that there are specific areas that have shown to have a direct impact on end results based on how they all work together. And if you can understand what these areas are and learn how to manage them properly, you could have a very high chance of not only improving your results over time, but also doing so with less anxiety, worry, fear, and emotions. A good friend of mine is a pilot for a commercial airline, and he told me once how being off track just 1 degree from the flight plan during takeoff can cause them to miss their ending destination by hundreds of miles. Sometimes the best way to make sure that you can create the best ending is by first focusing on what needs to be done during your beginning. And so the way we're going to do that today is by explaining the process I've seen investors go through time and time again that consistently causes them to go off their own investing flight path and completely miss their destination. Here's the process. Investors often end up with bad results because they make bad decisions. And the reason they often make these bad decisions is because it's based on their emotion and not their logic. But these emotions are created during the times that you feel frustrated. And this is the launching pad that sets everything off and creates that domino effect that can lead to bad decisions and ultimately poor results. So remember this: learning to manage your frustration is the first step to improving your investment potential. And in order to do this, you must first understand what leads you to become frustrated to begin with. And it's really very simple. Frustration begins when the true reality of what actually is happening does not meet your expectations of what you want to see happen. And the level of frustration is determined by the comparison between these two. The farther away your expectations are from true reality, the more frustrated you might become. However, on the flip side, the more in alignment that your expectations are with reality, the higher the probability that you will have little to no frustration, which can mean less emotion, fewer bad decisions, and better results. So for instance, you're on the road and you're heading to a meeting. You're cutting it close, but you expect to be there on time. And then suddenly you somehow get behind the slowest driver in the entire world. And then the reality of what you expect has changed and you begin to get frustrated. Or you've been working on a big project and the deadline is at the end of the day. You're putting all the pieces of the puzzle together, getting it all wrapped up so that you can get it in on time. And then the phone starts ringing. Then people start knocking on your doors. And then a meeting comes up. Suddenly you're starting to realize this may not be reality. And you become frustrated. But this is where it gets interesting. Because the real equation for frustration is not simply when your expectations don't meet true reality, but rather it's when your expectations don't meet what we perceive to be as reality. You see, our reality can change based on perception, and our perception can change based on the situation. During times when we are stressed or have high anxiety or emotion, things that may normally have no impression on us whatsoever, we now view in a different light. And we put more emphasis on them, often making it out to be a bigger deal than what it usually would be. But that's what our brain tells us, which then influences what we think, what we believe, and how we act. So what I mean by this is, people have always said, have you ever noticed when you're in a hurry, you always get behind the slowest person? Is that true reality, or is that what we perceive to be reality simply because we're in a rush? So maybe they're going the same speed they always would, but now we notice it so much more because it has become an obstacle to what we're trying to achieve. Or do we really have that many more interruptions when we're trying to get something done quickly? Maybe that's just our perception, and the reality is that we have the same number of interruptions that we have during a normal day. It's just that we don't really pay attention to them or see the importance of them because the situation is different. Economist Peter Bernstein related this problem quite well to the investing world when he said that investors display risk aversion when they're offered a choice in one setting, but then can quickly turn into risk seekers when they're offered the exact same choice, but in a different setting. He basically said that investors tend to ignore the common components of the bigger goal they're trying to reach, and instead they opt to focus on situations individually and in isolation based on what is occurring at the time. So the problem is that these perceptions cause us to view reality with a filtered lens. We put more or less emphasis on something based on our own situation and our own feelings. And this can cause us to completely overreact and do the wrong things at the wrong times. I'll give you an example we've probably all been through many times. How often have you been in traffic and you're trying to get somewhere? You're sitting in a lane, it's not moving at all. So you look over to your right and you notice the cars in the lane next to you are just whizzing by. So suddenly your perception is that you are in the slow lane. And what you need to do is immediately change lanes so that you can start moving. So what do? You put on your blinker, you look in your rearview mirror, and then you change lanes as soon as the opportunity presents itself. And then what happens? The lane you just moved to now comes to a grinding halt. And you look over and notice the lane you just came from starts to take off. So what do? Well, then your perception changes, and it tells you obviously must have made a mistake. So we put on our blinker, we look in our rearview mirror, and then we immediately change back to the lane we just came from, except now we're much farther back from where we first started. And then what happens? That lane stops, and on it goes. We've all done that, right? Not only have we done this once, but we've probably done it many times, and every time the same thing seems to happen over and over. This exact same thing occurs with investors. When the market starts to go down, suddenly thoughts of past declines take over your mind and your body, which then raises your anxiety and causes your emotions to take over. And this creates the perception that suddenly we're on the brink of the next major market downfall. Your fear sets in, your panic emerges, alarms go off, and then you do whatever you can to stop the pain. You jump ship, you go to cash, you get out while you can. And then right when you do that, suddenly the market starts to bounce back. It turns green. And you suddenly realize that maybe your perception may have been wrong. So as quick as you can, you immediately try to correct your mistake. And you chase prices back up, trying to get in wherever you can, which is above where you first exited. And And then right when you get back in, the market starts to slow and the fear returns, and on it goes. This is the exact process that causes so many investors to fall behind and lose money again and again. They keep doing the same thing over and over while expecting different results. So one thing that influences our perception of reality is based on how we feel. We always have the mentality that if it feels right, it must be right, but that's not always true. In fact, some of the best investing decisions I have ever made felt the most uncomfortable and in fact downright scary at times. If it feels right doesn't always mean that it is right. I mean, if I always did what felt good to me, then I would be eating ice cream for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So gauging your decisions based on how you feel is not really a reliable source, because being uncomfortable with something doesn't mean that it's a bad sign. Think about the first time that you approached that person that ultimately became your spouse. Chances are you may have been a little uncomfortable at the time. Or what about the first time you purchased a house? It's a very big deal. And it can be both exciting and scary at the same time. We often opt for leaning on what feels good more when making a decision when three things happen. One, the stakes are higher. Two, we don't feel like we have all the information we need. And three, we don't really have a full understanding of the situation. When these things occur is when we begin to make our own assumptions and determine on how we perceive things to be. English writer and philosopher Aldous Huxley once said, "There are things that are known and things that are unknown, and in between are the doors of perception." Neuroscientist Gregory Burns once stated that perception is the brain's way of explaining unclear signals it receives, and it does so in the most likely way possible based on previous experiences. So in other words, we interpret the way we see things going forward based on how we have been affected by them in the past. We create our own judgments and jump to conclusions, which gives us a distorted picture of reality. So how do we control this so that our perceptions are more in line with what reality really is? Thomas Dewar once said, "Minds are like parachutes. They work best when they're open." How many times have you gone into a situation with a closed mind and then figured out later on that maybe you were jumping to conclusion and looked at it the wrong way? A friend of mine told me a story a few years back that I think provides a great example of this. He was visiting New York City at the time, and he signed up to take one of those guided bus tours. As often happens in New York, he got caught up in traffic and ended up arriving a few minutes late. The bus was already packed and all the seats were taken, so he ended up having to stand during the ride. As the bus began its tour, he saw an older woman a few rows ahead of him who was standing and seemed to be having a little bit of trouble. He then noticed a young man sitting in the seat right next to her, and he began to wonder why in the world this guy had not offered his seat to this woman. He told me that after a while, this began to consume him, and he even started getting a little angry. He just kept thinking about how rude this guy was, so much so that he wasn't even paying attention to the tour guide or what they were talking about. After about an hour, the bus finally came to a stop, and everyone was supposed to get off and they would continue the tour on foot. So they all formed a little single file line and exited the bus one by one until eventually everybody was off and were just standing around waiting for the next part of the tour. Then suddenly the back door of the bus opened up, and an electric lift brought down a young man in a wheelchair. The same man who he had been so upset with this whole trip, simply because he had jumped to conclusions and he had perceived something that was not true. He said he remembered in that moment just how awful he felt, and he made it a point to strike up conversation with that guy, which he did. And eventually he found out that the young man had lost the use of his legs 3 years prior in a diving accident. And the woman? He found out that was actually his mother, who had brought him to New York City as a reward for graduating college. My buddy remarked how every time since then, when he starts to jump to a conclusion, he thinks about that day. And it reminds him to always try to keep an open mind, because sometimes things are not what we see them to be. So for you as an investor, keeping an open mind is the first step to be able to control and manage your perception and narrow the gap between your perceived reality and what is true reality. So we mentioned earlier in the show that frustration is determined and can be managed based on the relationship between two things: your perception of what is, and your expectation of what should be. So now that we've talked about how to manage perception, it's time to get into an even bigger issue. How do you manage your expectations? Because expectations is the most powerful force between the two, and is actually the barometer that influences how you see things. Think about, we perceive things to be good or bad based on our expectations. You hear about a great movie and everybody tells you how wonderful it is, and you have your expectations built up so high that when you go see it, you don't really think it's that great. But on the other end of the spectrum, how many times have you gone to a movie and everybody says it's not that good, or you have no expectations at all? And then as you're watching it, you think, hey, this is pretty good. You may not even realize it, but we talk about our expectations all the time. Hey, how's that new job you started? Not what I expected. How's that play you went to last night? It was actually better than we expected. So very often, it's not the experience or the event itself that can cause us a certain amount of emotions, to be sad, mad, glad, scared, or excited, but rather it's based on the relationship between the reality of what is versus the reality of what we expected it to be. Now, the third part of this, which is probably the most important, is understanding what you should be comparing your expectations against. You see, planning for your financial future is kind of like going on a trip you've never been on before. And you can do it one of two ways. Number one, you could just head out on your own and pick any road. And then along the way, just kind of figure out which road to turn on and which direction to head. And then hopefully, ultimately, one day you will end up at your destination. Or the alternative, which most of us would do, is before we go out on this trip to a destination we've never been to before, we plug in the coordinates and we get a map. In the old days, we used to get the old Rand McNally. That was about 8 feet by 8 feet, and we'd open it up in the car and try to follow all the squiggly lines. But now we just plug it into our phone, and it'll actually tell us where to go. It will tell us exactly what road we need to stay on, and then if we ever get off track, how to get back on track along the way. So our main goal is making sure that we stay on that road so that we can get to our destination in the most efficient way possible, based on what the map tells us to do. Your financial future and the planning for your financial future is the same thing. You should have a financial roadmap of sorts that should tell you exactly what road you need to stay on. And then along the way, it will continually assess to make sure that you stay on that road. And if not, what you need to do to get back on track. When you go on a road trip, there are chances that you might hit rainstorms. You might have some sunny days. You might hit traffic. You might even be detoured onto another road. But do you turn around and go back home? Do you just say, this isn't worth it, let's just get off this road and try something new? Or do you make adjustments and then adapt and keep on going based on what the map tells you to do? Same thing with your financial plan. If you're always focusing on the weather, the rain and the sun, the ups and downs of the market, and that's what you're comparing your expectations to, expecting it to be sunny every single day, then you're losing track of what you really need to be focused on, which is making sure that you stay on the correct road that you have laid out in front of you. That is what you should base your expectations on. And as long as you do that, you keep your expectations realistic and you understand that things might come up along the way, then this will help you keep in line with the true reality. And like we've said throughout this whole show, the closer that your expectations can get in line with true reality, the better you will be able to manage your frustration, which can lower your emotions, causing you to be proactive instead of reactive through making better decisions, which ultimately can lead to better results. So the key takeaway and the secret to managing your perceptions, your expectations, and your frustration is by focusing on what you can control and not worrying about what you can't. Or if you just so happen to join the World Series of Poker next year, you can look at it this way. If you can't change the cards you're dealt, then change how you play your hand. Just like Mr. Kenny Rogers said, you got to know when to hold them and know when to fold them. See you at the next episode.
Want more financial insanity? Need to contact us or ask a question? Great. First, subscribe and review us on iTunes. Then head over to financialinsanity.com to join our community, download additional episodes, and access articles. Thanks for listening to this episode, and be sure to join us next time as we teach more ways to enhance your finance and stop the insanity.
Advisory services offered through Enhance Wealth, a member of Advisory Services Network, LLC.